G'day everyone, and welcome to week 10 of our course on legal ethics and trust accounting. I can start this week with two bits of really good news. First, we have completed the 2 weeks on trust accounting. Hooray! Second, we've completed our 5 weeks on the duties of solicitors to their clients. So we've spoken about the paramount duty to the court, we've spoken about the range of duties to the client. This week, we come to the duties that legal practitioners have towards one another. In this first video, we're going to speak about the duty to be courteous and professional. In the second video this week, we're going to talk about the duty not to take advantage of another practitioner's mistakes. And in the third video, we'll talk about the duties of a practitioner if there is an inadvertent disclosure by another practitioner. So let's start with some general observations about the duty of courtesy. Rule 4.1.2 of the Australian Solicitors Conduct Rules requires solicitors to be honest and courteous in all dealings in the course of legal practice. By extension, this includes dealings with other legal practitioners. Now, if your interest in the law was sparked by American legal TV, then you'll probably be a bit puzzled by that statement. TV shows are built on drama. A show which demonstrated professional people dealing with one another with courtesy and respect, well, that show would probably be cancelled 5 minutes after it goes to air. And in most firms, if you carried on the way they do on those shows, then you would be cancelled within 5 minutes. I don't want to romanticise it though. Legal practice can be a tough game. Ours is the only adversarial profession. When an architect designs a house, there's not some opposing architect doing all they can to point out flaws in the design. When a doctor makes a diagnosis, there's not some opposing doctor trying to show they've got it wrong. Sometimes your opponents, your adversaries, are going to be working hard to show that you're wrong and your client is wrong and that your client should lose and pay costs. And sometimes they'll do this in an assertive, almost aggressive way. I mean, this isn't an episode of the Smurfs. But there are lines of courtesy that should not be crossed and lines of courtesy that must not be crossed. Some of the courtesies are formulaic, but they exist to remind practitioners of the need for courtesy. For instance, in court, when referring to your opponent, you refer to them as my friend, or if they're a barrister, my learned friend. It's not like we really all are friends, but sometimes words matter. Let's talk about some specifics for these courtesies. First and foremost, we must not over-identify with our client's case, and we must not over-identify our opponent with their client's case. Our opponent is not our enemy, they're our colleague. To take a sporting analogy, you might have 2 football teams or 2 netball teams who are fiercely competitive on the field, really going hard. But ideally, they should be able to shake hands afterwards and have a drink and leave the competition on the field. If someone brings personal animosity onto the field, or if they bring their competition into their off-field life, most people would think that's pretty poor sport. It's the same in the law. Your opponent didn't choose their client. The client chose them. And even if your opponent seems to be acting in a completely unreasonable way, you have no idea what might be going on behind closed doors. They might have been strongly suggesting that their client settle the matter, and their client might have rejected that advice and instructed them to proceed to trial. You don't know, and your opponent doesn't know what's happening on your side of the table. In the same way, if you find yourself opposed to a lawyer who you just don't like, you can't afford to let that personal animosity get in the way of helping your client. And your opponent can't let any antagonism get in the way of their aspirations. There's nothing more undignified than a legal dispute that becomes a chest-beating exercise between 2 lawyers who've forgotten about their clients completely and they're just trying to defeat one another. Again though, all of this is easy to say, but it can be much more challenging in practice. We all have a sense of justice, and if you really do believe that your client is in the right, it can be very easy to over-identify with your client. And as a result, it can be very easy to see your opponent as someone who is promulgating evil. If you want to see an example where many of the practitioners ended up looking just awful, have a read of a family law case from 2012 called Pensius and Pensius. Our job is to give the best representation we can to our client. It's not to indulge in our own egos, and it's not to pick fights. We are ministers of justice and officers of the court with an overriding duty to assist the court to make a just decision. A commitment to professional courtesy helps to underline this. It follows from this that lawyers should not be disparaging towards one another. You're allowed, indeed you're required, to do everything you can to point out to your opponent the weakness in their client's case. You're allowed to advocate vigorously, but there is a difference between criticising your opponent's case and criticising your opponent themselves. A High Court case called Lander against the Council of the Law Society of the ACT extensively discussed the difference between hard advocacy and unprofessional discourtesy. And this was discussed at length in a very useful Victorian case called the Victorian Legal Services Commissioner against McDonald, a case in which one practitioner called another practitioner fundamentally dishonest and then doubled down when invited to retract the allegation. Next, and I admit this had probably come as a surprise to many lay people, legal practitioners are under a duty to behave with scrupulous honesty towards one another. Way back in week 3, we learned about the duty to be scrupulously honest to the court. Well, that requirement extends to dealings with other practitioners. If your client hasn't signed the settlement document because he's on holidays, for goodness sake, don't tell your opponent that the delay is due to your client being unwell or something like that. Scrupulous honesty is even more important when you're involved in settlement negotiations. Now look, everyone knows that during a negotiation you're going to put the best possible spin on your client's case, and you've got to try and make your opponent's case seem weak. You're going to do this even if in your heart of hearts you think the opponent's case is quite strong. There's nothing unethical about that. As we discussed in week 3, there's nothing wrong with using the term "I am instructed" to signal that you don't personally know if something's true, but your client says it's true, so you're proceeding on that basis. What you can't do is outright lie. Consider the Legal Services Commission against Mullins, where there was a dispute between an insurer and a quadriplegic plaintiff claiming personal injury damages. Now, one of the factors used when determining damages in personal injury cases is the likely life expectancy of the plaintiff. It's a bit morbid, but obviously a person who is 20 is likely to have to endure permanent pain and suffering for a lot longer than someone who is, say, 80. In this case, after becoming a quadriplegic, the client was also diagnosed with terminal cancer. Talk about crappy luck. The barrister ought to have disclosed this because it substantially reduced life expectancy and therefore substantially reduced the likely settlement sum. However, the barrister did not disclose it, and the settlement concluded as though the plaintiff was expected to live a normal length life. This was professional misconduct. Finally, there are a number of other behaviours which, in this day and age, really ought to need no explanation. We've discussed them a little bit in the first week of the course. It's not okay to discriminate against other practitioners or treat them differently because of their gender, their age, their sexuality, their pregnancy status, their race, any disability they may have. It's true that there once was a time when the law was a club for educated white males from a certain social class. Those days are gone now. Look around your own class. I mean, as I write this lecture in very late 2021, we have a female Chief Justice of Australia, Susan Kiefel, a female Chief Justice of Queensland, Catherine Holmes, a female Governor of Queensland, Jeanette Young, and a female Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk. Discrimination, harassment, bullying, these are not just unprofessional conduct as a practitioner, they're plain old bad behaviour as a human being. Now look, having said this, I want to go back and repeat, the law is not some happy garden of justice full of exaggerated courtesies and niceness. Your client does not want you to go out of your way to make life easy for your opponent. They want you to unleash the damn kraken. If you're not up for the fight, find another profession. But the fight has rules. Attack the argument, not the proponent. Remember that your opponent has their instructions, and they have to put those instructions. And most of all, remember that this profession can sometimes be surprisingly small. It's not unusual to deal with the same practitioners on the other side again and again. A reputation for being tough but courteous will stand you in good stead for years to come. On the other hand, one nasty episode might feel fantastic in the moment, but it's short-term thinking in a long-term career. Okay, that's it for video 1. In the next video, we're going to talk about the rule that you cannot take advantage of another solicitor's error. See you again soon.